Oh, yeah?
Well, yes, exactly. Discuss that. I'm joined by Bundeep Rangar from IndusView. Bundeep, welcome. Let's start then, not on stress, but a story in the Wall Street Journal. Front page, crop prices jumped to two-year highs amidst heat wave, and actually that could have implications for us all, couldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a classic case of supply and demand, right? You've had drought in Russia, forest fires there, etc. You've had floods in Australia and certainly dryness in Argentina, all of which have contributed to a shortage in supply. And then you've got rising demand in China, rising demand in Egypt, which is, by the way, the world's largest wheat importer. Not to mention the fact that the US dollar is dropping, so it makes the exports and general purchase of crop commodities much more attractive.
I mean, it's yet another sign, isn't it? We could all be paying more for our food, and that potentially could have a knock-on effect for global growth as well.
It's certainly going to affect our grocery bill for sure, yeah.
But in some ways, though, the American harvest has been quite a good harvest, so that will alleviate some of this, won't it?
Well, it'll alleviate insofar as the supply rises, but it's still lower where the demand is and where supply should have been if Russia was on track, and for that matter, South America and India were on track.
I suppose the danger as well, we might see in Latin America what we saw in Russia over the summer, that the government starts restricting exports.
Absolutely, and to start putting rations on things like you've seen in the past.
It's a pity they can't have some of that water in Australia.
Unbelievable. They've had the largest floods day in like 50 years.
Exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, especially after the drought they had as well.
Exactly.
That's another area where crops and
global warming, or is there something else?
Yeah.
Well, let's move to more temporal matters. Back on Earth, Financial Times, the Vatican is saying, according to the Financial Times, the Vatican is going to fight money laundering, and that's following an investigation by Italian prosecutors.
Well, I believe this is the responsible thing to do. There's certainly allegations, and there's two transfers worth 23 million euros that are frozen. But the Vatican's really saying, look, they're going to set up an agency to look into it, and moreover, they're going to be compliant with international norms, so they fall in line with several other countries that have pretty strict anti-money laundering compliance.
I guess the problem with the Vatican, though, is it's so used to doing things its way, which we all perceive as being very, very secret, that it'll be quite difficult to move from that mindset of this is the way we do it to that transparency.
And that's where the tension lies, absolutely, Sally, because you've got a requirement to show source of funds when you do money transfers, and then the Vatican's own impetus to keep, for its own good reasons, things private.
There's always been an issue of transparency, hasn't there, around the Vatican and its financial dealings there and the banks that are involved in the Vatican. You know, as long as I can remember, going back, of course, years when a leading Vatican financier hanged himself in a bridge in London.
God's banker, Roberto Calvi.
Indeed, yeah, yeah.
Let's move on to being 100 years old, and how the British population, in particularly, 1/5 of us will end up living over 100 years. Now, that puts strain on family relationships, but also on the pension pots and the health service, doesn't it?
I think there's some major computations going to happen by the actuarial industry to see how that affects pensions and payouts. I mean, the great thing about that for us, of course, is that people, out of that 10 million, more than half, about 5.5 million, are people of our age group between 16 and 50. So that's something to look forward to at a New Year's Eve. Having said that, of course, that means for Britain as a country, you've got now more people who are older and fewer than that under 16 that are going to eventually support that aging population.
And the key thing, of course, being at least over 80 as well, is simply the deterioration in a person's body. It doesn't work as well. It's not designed to work as well,
is
it?
That most mornings, yes.
But again, that places an enormous strain, and you say, on the rising population to support them.
Well, in the Western world in generally, there's an aging demograph, and that's part of the problem that might be there in the future when you have insufficient funds in pensions and savings accounts to support that. And you contrast that with a place like Turkey or India, which has a much younger population, and you can see where the world economics might go in over time. Having said that, though, medical technology is marvelous, and I believe that if people are living longer, part of it is due to that. So hopefully we can get some more stents in our system to support us as we go along.
And you mentioned pension funds. There are some interesting figures in the Daily Telegraph newspaper today. Most workers, it says, retire with a pension previously intended to fund a retirement of 10 or 20 years rather than an extra 30 years of life. For example, savings of £100,000 would pay out at least £5,000 a year for 2 decades, but less than £3,500 over 3 decades. That really shows, doesn't it, how serious it is?
The question is, right now you have about 10,000 people a year who live over 100. In the next 50 years, that would be 500,000 people a year. Not to mention the fact that the Queen sends telegrams to people when they hit 100. I'm not sure how many telegrams. She might switch to emails.
Talking of the Queen and the impending royal wedding that we have next year in the UK, this story here that apparently the unions are planning mass industrial action around about that time. In some ways, I guess, to take the gloss off the occasion.
I mean, it's impeccable timing from their perspective, isn't it? It's the most tourist-friendly time, and this is the time when they're threatening to strike not only for public servants, but also in the face of cutbacks, but also travel. And you've seen how that's devastated British Airways in the past, not to mention the weather. That's not been very kind.
What I don't understand about all this, though, it's almost as though they're talking about a coordinated campaign between unions. That's quite difficult under Britain's labour laws, which, of course, were changed during Mrs. Thatcher's time in the 1980s, precisely to stop unions getting together and having strikes across a wide variety of industries, that it became much more focused. You had to have a ballot on each individual sector. It had to be for a specific strike. And this was meant to make all this much harder.
And you've got the Essential Services Act on top of that, too, to mitigate against that. And you don't have that's why French-style nationwide across industry strikes. Having said that, though, I think they can time it somewhat differently, so you can have it over 2 weeks and still have different sectors going on strike, from public servants to the travel industry. The ballot's on January 21st, so I think we'll find out a lot more in the next few weeks. This is great posturing, though, for a really, really good sense of timing from the union's perspective.
What do you think this tells us about the way the economy is playing out over the next 12 months and the difficulties as austerity starts to bite this?
Well, clearly spending cuts are going to start affecting people, and you can see already predictions about housing prices dropping 10% across the country, in part because of lower spending power.
And then very briefly, this working part-time. I mean, a lot of people do this, the flexi time, the offices not having enough desks because people come in and out. That surely could, again, with an ageing population, could only be a good thing.
Absolutely, and I think if you look, there's a great book out there called Why Dutch Women Don't Get Depressed, and part of the reason why it's there is because they work flexi hours, they work 4 days a week, and 3 days a week for family, and they can still pull off between 25 and 40 hours a week. And given all the telecommunication possibilities and telecommuting possibilities, it certainly seems to make sense. Google is a great example of flexible working hours, of course, and you see productivity still very high.
All right, Bundeep, thank you very much indeed for joining us. An interesting story, that one. I was in Holland talking about that just the other day. Anyway, from the two of us for the moment, thank you very much. There's much more still to come right here on the BBC.